They say I have ice in my veins. That I built my real estate empire on ruthlessness and nerve. Maybe they're right. But even the coldest heart can be broken by a single text message, especially when it's from your only son. It read, "Don't bother coming to the family reunion this year. We're cutting ties." My family, led by my ungrateful brother, thought they could just erase me. They mistook my generosity for weakness. I replied with a single word. "Okay." Then I made one phone call. 24 hours later, my phone had 59 missed calls from my panicked, desperate family. They were about to learn what happens when you try to cut ties with the woman who holds all the strings. This is the story of how I dismantled their world, piece by piece. If you're ready to see how it all unfolds, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter. Like this post if you believe revenge is a dish best served cold, and comment below. What do you think was the first thing I took away from them? The message arrived without ceremony, a sterile blue bubble on the screen of my phone. It glowed in the dim light of my penthouse, a digital dagger delivered with brutal efficiency. "Don't bother coming to the family reunion this year. We're cutting ties." The words were from Ethan, my son. My only child. I stared at them, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Outside, the lights of Manhattan glittered like a sea of fallen stars, a kingdom I had conquered one skyscraper at a time. Inside this glass tower, the silence was absolute. My heart gave a single painful thud against my ribs, a protest I immediately quashed. Emotion was a liability, a lesson I had learned decades ago and had never forgotten. I could picture the scene perfectly. My brother, David, would be standing behind Ethan, a hand on his shoulder. His expression one of false sympathy. David's wife, Claire, would be nearby. Her face a mask of concerned sincerity, the same mask she wore when asking for a larger budget for her vanity charity. They were termites, gnawing at the foundations of my life for years, and now they had finally chewed through to the heartwood. They had turned my own son into their weapon. For years, I had ignored their petty jealousies, their endless grasping. I had mistaken their greed for simple ambition. I had mistaken my son's absorption of their poison for youthful rebellion. These were mistakes I would not make again. My fingers, steady and sure, typed out my reply. 2 letters. 1 word. Quiet declaration of war. B. I sent the message and set my phone face down on the cold marble of the coffee table. It was done. They had drawn their line in the sand. Now they would see what happens when you try to exile the woman who owns the beach. I didn't sit and stew. I didn't pour a drink. I rose from the silk sofa and walked through the cavernous living space, my bare feet silent on the polished Italian floor. My reflection moved with me across the floor-to-ceiling windows, a woman in a simple cashmere lounge set, her posture unbent, her expression unreadable. To the world I was Eleanor Vance, a name synonymous with power in New York real estate. In that moment I was just a mother with a job to do. My study was my sanctuary, a room of dark wood, leather, and the faint, clean scent of old books. It was the only room in the penthouse that felt truly mine, the place where the blueprints for my empire were born. I didn't turn on the main lights. I sat behind my massive mahogany desk, the city lights framing me, and picked up the receiver of my private desk line, a landline untraceable and secure. I dialed the 10 digits from memory. It rang only once. Yes. The voice on the other end was male, calm and clipped. No name given, none needed. Julian had been my counsel, my confidant, and my corporate weapon for 20 years. "Julian, it's Nora," I said, my voice even. "I assumed," he replied. There was a pause, pregnant with understanding. He knew I only ever used this line for one reason. "Initiate the Vance protocol," I said. There was no hesitation, no request for clarification. The Vance protocol was a series of catastrophic, interlocking corporate and legal maneuvers we had designed years ago as a doomsday weapon. A scorched earth response to the ultimate betrayal. I had hoped I would never have to use it. "Understood," Julian said. "Consider it done." The line went dead. I placed the receiver back in its cradle with a soft, definitive click. That was it. My only action. I had pointed the gun and pulled the trigger. Now, all I had to do was wait for the sound of the shot to echo across their world. I leaned back in my leather chair, the skyline my witness, and let my mind drift. I thought of my first project, a run-down warehouse in a forgotten corner of Brooklyn. I was 26, a widow with a toddler at home, and all I had was a crazy idea and a small inheritance from my late husband. While men in slick suits laughed at me, I saw the future. I bought it, I flipped it, and I didn't stop. When my empire was stable, David came to me. My younger brother, with his easy smile and a resume full of failed ventures. He needed a job. Family is family, so I gave him one. I created a whole division for him to run. Vance Hospitality. I gave him a title, a staggering salary, and the illusion of importance. He and Claire took to the life as if they were born to it, which in a way they were. They were born to spend my money. The Hamptons estate I bought for the family became their estate. The charity I endowed for my late husband's legacy became Claire's platform for social climbing. I'll never forget the time she pitched me on a 7-figure donation to a museum, not for the art, but because the naming rights on the new wing would get her a seat on their acquisitions board. When I refused, her smile tightened, and I saw a flicker of pure venom in her eyes. For years I saw their hand in everything. The business reporter who got an anonymous tip about a project delay. The board member who suddenly questioned my leadership. The constant, whispered suggestions to Ethan that his mother cared more about concrete and steel than she did about him. They were amateurs, clumsy in their machinations, and I let it slide because they were family, because I hoped Ethan would see through them. Another mistake, my last one. My gaze fell on a framed photo on my desk, the only personal item in the room. It was Ethan, age 7, a gap-toothed grin on his face, holding up a lopsided clay mug he'd made for me. He'd proudly told me it was for the best boss mom in the world. My heart ached with the memory. Where did that boy go? Nowhere. He got lost in the shuffle of board meetings and transatlantic flights. He was raised by nannies while I fought tooth and nail in a world that wanted to chew up women like me and spit them out. I did it all for him, to build a world so secure he would never know the fear I had known. And in building his fortress, I had left him alone inside it. That loneliness was the crack David and Claire had slipped into. They were there for the soccer games I missed. They took him on the ski trips I had to cancel. They filled his head with a comforting narrative. It's not your fault your mother is absent. She's just ambitious. It's what she cares about. They became the loving aunt and uncle, the sympathetic ear, while I became the distant, cold source of the money that paid for it all. They used my sacrifice as a weapon against me. They took my guilt, that deep, primal guilt that every working mother feels, and twisted it into a justification for their coup. They convinced my son that my love was conditional, that my legacy was more important than him. They were wrong. My legacy, my empire, my entire world. It was all just a pedestal for him. And they had just convinced him to kick it over. The next 24 hours passed in a state of surreal calm. I followed my routine with monastic discipline. Morning swim, market analysis, a series of conference calls. I ate my lunch at my desk. I did not check my personal phone. At 4:15 p.m., a single, discrete notification popped up on my desktop. It was from the alert system Julian had set up. Subject: Project Olympus. Halted. NYC Department of Buildings has issued an immediate stop work order on the Olympus Tower development, citing an extensive anonymous report detailing multiple zoning violations and potential material fraud. All permits revoked pending full investigation. D. Vance was notified at 16:09 Eastern Standard Time. Project Olympus was David's magnum opus. A glittering monument to his own ego, funded entirely by my capital. It was also, as Julian's private auditors had discovered weeks ago, a labyrinth of shell corporations and kickbacks designed to siphon millions into David's offshore accounts. A slow, cold smile touched my lips. The first tremor. A moment later, the screen of my personal phone, still face down on my desk, lit up. It vibrated against the wood, a frantic, insistent buzz. I didn't need to look. I knew who it was. The display would read David. I let it buzz. I watched the city lights begin their nightly ascent, one by one. The phone went silent. Then, a few seconds later, it started again. And again. The first of the 59 calls had begun. I leaned back, my work for the day done, and simply listened to the sound of my brother's panic. The phone didn't stop. For the rest of the evening, it was a constant, desperate pulse against the marble. After David's 10th call went unanswered, the texts began, a torrent of frantic digital shouting. "Nora, call me. It's an emergency. What the hell is going on with Olympus? My funding is gone. This is your fault. I know it is. Pick up the phone." Then came the others. My cousin, who worked in David's division, asking why his corporate card was suddenly declined. An aunt, wondering if I'd heard the terrible news. And then Claire. Her texts were dripping with passive aggression. "Nora, darling. David is in a state. We should really all talk. I do hope this isn't some sort of misunderstanding. The reunion is next week. Ethan is very worried." That last one was a deliberate twist of the knife. Finally, around 10 p.m., a new name appeared. "Ethan. Uncle David is freaking out. Said you ruined him." Was. Then another message. "Is this because of my text?" I read that one twice. The flicker of childish fear in it almost made me break my silence. Almost. But this lesson required immersion. He needed to see his uncle and aunt for who they truly were, stripped of the wealth that made them charming. I left him on read. By the time I went to bed, the log was a litany of their panic. 37 calls from David, 16 from Claire, a handful from panicked relatives, and 6 hesitant attempts from Ethan. 59 missed calls. I slept soundly for the first time in months. The next morning, I was reviewing quarterly reports when Julian's email arrived. The subject line was simply, Phase 2. The body of the email was a bulleted list of actions executed overnight. All corporate accounts managed by D. Vance have been frozen pending forensic audit. All corporate credit lines and expense accounts for the Vance Hospitality Division have been suspended. An anonymous, comprehensive file has been delivered to the board of the Claire Vance Foundation for the Arts, detailing financial irregularities and the use of donated funds for personal expenses. An emergency board meeting has been called. I pictured Claire at one of her ridiculously expensive luncheons, surrounded by the city's elite, her hand-sewn Chanel bag on the table. I saw the moment her Amex Centurion card, the one paid for by a corporate account she saw as a bottomless pit, was declined. I imagined the waiter's polite but firm voice, the sudden silence at the table, the curious and judgmental eyes of the women whose approval she craved more than air. The public humiliation would be 1,000 times worse for her than the financial cutoff. I typed a one-word reply to Julian. A moment later he responded. "Cages locked. David and Claire thought they were partners in my empire. They thought the mansions, the cars, the lavish lifestyles were their birthright. They were fools. They had never bothered to read the fine print. Years ago, when the company first became a billion-dollar entity, Julian and I had restructured everything. On paper, Vance Industries was a collection of subsidiaries and divisions. But in reality, every share of stock, every deed to every property, every dollar in every trust fund was legally owned by a single, impenetrable parent entity. The NV Master Trust. NV Nora Vance. I was the sole, irrevocable trustee. My name was the only one on the signature line that mattered. David wasn't a president. He was a manager. Claire wasn't a philanthropist. She was the beneficiary of a discretionary allowance. The house they lived in, the cars they drove, the very tuition they paid for their children's boarding schools, it all flowed from a tap that I, and I alone, controlled. Their names were on nothing of actual value. Their power was an illusion I had curated for the sake of family peace. For 2 decades, they had lived in a gilded cage and mistaken it for a palace. The Vance Protocol wasn't an attack. It was simply me closing the door and turning the key. The news about Project Olympus broke online that afternoon. It wasn't just a story about a zoning dispute anymore. Financial journalists, armed with the details from Julian's anonymous tip, were now using words like embezzlement, fraud, and criminal investigation. David Vance's name was front and center. Ethan's texts started again around 3 p.m. They were different this time. The anger was gone, replaced by a thread of confusion. The news is saying Uncle David stole money. That can't be true, right? He and Aunt Claire told me you were squeezing them out. But this is something else. I stared at the screen, my resolve hardening. This was the most critical phase. His entire worldview, carefully constructed by his uncle's lies, was beginning to fracture. He needed to sit with that dissonance. He needed to question the narrative he had so willingly believed. An hour later, the final text of the day arrived. It was the one I had been waiting for. "Mom, what did you do?" It wasn't an accusation anymore. It was a question. A real one. I read it, felt the weight of his dawning horror, and put the phone away. His education was progressing. The final act of the week was brutally simple. The vendors for the family reunion began to cancel, their deposits having been charged to now frozen accounts. The sprawling North Shore estate where the party was to be held was, of course, an asset of the NV Master Trust. At 5 p.m. on Friday, a legal courier delivered a certified letter to David and Claire's front door. I knew because I was watching. One of the perks of owning everything is a comprehensive, integrated security system. On the large screen in my study, I pulled up the feed from the front gate of the Long Island property. I watched as Claire, dressed in tennis whites, snatched the envelope from the courier. I saw her tear it open, her face contorting from annoyance to disbelief, and then to pure, unadulterated rage. It was an eviction notice, giving them 30 days to vacate the property owned by the trust. She screamed something I couldn't hear and threw the papers on the manicured lawn. A few minutes later, a black SUV pulled up to the gate. It was Claire, presumably trying to leave to confront me in the city. I watched as she swiped her keycard. Access denied. She tried again. Access denied. My gate would not open. She got out of the car and began screaming at the call box, her face distorted and ugly on my high-definition screen. I leaned back, taking a sip of tea. The illusion wasn't just shattered. It was being bulldozed into dust. And I had the best seat in the house. They found me on Monday morning. I had known they would try, so I wasn't surprised when they bypassed the doorman at my office building by calling in a favor with a long-time tenant they knew. As I stepped out of the private elevator into the marble lobby, they were there, waiting for me like ghouls. David looked haggard, his expensive suit rumpled. Claire stood beside him, her face a ruin of tear-streaked makeup and venom. They looked small and cheap under the lobby's soaring ceilings. "Nora," David began, his voice raspy. "You have to stop this. You're destroying us. You're destroying the family." "You did that," I stated, my voice quiet but carrying in the vast space. "This is just the paperwork catching up." Claire lunged forward, her voice a hiss. "How could you? After everything we've done for you, for Ethan. We were his parents when you were too busy playing God with your buildings." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it all was almost impressive. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply opened the leather briefcase my driver was holding and pulled out a slim file. I handed it to David. "My lawyers suggested I wait," I said calmly. "But I wanted you to have a copy personally. It's a summary of the evidence Julian's auditors collected. Wire transfers, offshore accounts, emails between the two of you and a competitor discussing a buyout after a hostile takeover. It's all there." David's face went from pale to sheet white as he scanned the first page. Claire peered over his shoulder, and a strangled sob escaped her lips. "The district attorney has the full version," I added, my voice devoid of emotion. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting." I walked past them without a backward glance, leaving them standing in the middle of the lobby with the wreckage of their lives in their hands. That night, alone in my study, the ghost I had kept locked away for 30 years came to visit. His name was Frank Miller. He was my first business partner, my mentor, the man who had co-signed the loan for that first warehouse in Brooklyn. He had believed in me when no one else would. And then he had tried to destroy me. When the project became a runaway success, he saw his opportunity. He called a secret meeting with our investors. He painted me as a hysterical young widow, too emotional and grief-stricken to handle the pressures of a real business. He argued that for the good of the company, my shares should be bought out, and control should be consolidated under him. He used my own pain and my gender as his primary leverage. I found out by accident, from a junior accountant who felt guilty. I was 27 years old with a 4-year-old son. I had 2 days before the investor vote that would have erased me. In those 48 hours, I learned more about corporate warfare than I had in a lifetime. I found my own leverage, made my own back-channel deals, and I didn't just survive his coup, I turned it back on him. I dismantled his position so thoroughly and quietly that by the time the vote was scheduled, he had already resigned in disgrace. That was the day I promised myself. Never again. Never again would I be vulnerable. Never again would my fate rest in the hands of another. I built my empire as a fortress, with moats and high walls and only one master key. The Vance Protocol wasn't born from this fight with David. It was born from the ghost of Frank Miller. I was simply using it for the first time. He came on Wednesday evening. I knew he would. I saw him on the security camera, standing hesitantly outside my apartment door, and buzzed him in myself. Ethan looked older than he had a week ago. The arrogant certainty was gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out shame. He stood awkwardly in the foyer, unable to meet my eyes. "Mom," he started, his voice cracking. He stopped and swallowed hard. "I spoke to Susan in accounting. She's been with you since the beginning. She told me about Frank Miller." I remained silent, letting him find his words. "She told me everything. How you brought Uncle David in, how many times you covered his debts, his mistakes. How you set up his division so he could never really damage the parent company." He finally looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "All those years, he told me you were cold, that you didn't trust anyone. He never told me why." He took a shaky breath. "I was a fool. I was so angry and arrogant. I believed them because it was easier than trying to understand you. I'm so sorry, Mom. For the text. For everything. I'm so sorry." The apology was raw and real. The walls of my fortress didn't crumble, but for the first time in years, I felt a tremor in the foundation. I gave a slight nod. "I know, Ethan." Saturday arrived. The day of the family reunion that wasn't. The North Shore estate was locked up, its lawns immaculate and empty. My brother and his wife were in a hotel, drowning in legal fees. That evening, I had my chef prepare a simple dinner, and Ethan and I sat at the small table in my private kitchen, not the cavernous formal dining room. The silence was thick with unspoken words. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Ethan asked, pushing a piece of pasta around his plate. "About Frank Miller. About any of it." "I wanted to protect you," I answered honestly. "I wanted you to have a normal childhood, a normal family. I didn't want you to live in my world of suspicion and contingency plans. So you let me think my uncle was a saint and my mother was a tyrant," he countered, a flash of the old fire in his eyes. "That," I conceded, meeting his gaze, "was my mistake. I built walls to keep the threats out, Ethan. I didn't realize I had locked you on the other side with them. The protocol. It wasn't just about punishing David. It was about tearing down a structure that was rotten to its core, even if it hurt." For the first time I told him everything. The struggles, the betrayals, the crushing loneliness of being at the top. I didn't ask for his forgiveness. I simply gave him the truth he should have had all along. I treated him not as a boy to be protected, but as the man he was supposed to become. "My son. My heir." The following week, I met with Julian in his downtown office. The panoramic view of the financial district felt appropriate. "They'll take the plea deal," he said, sliding a folder across the polished table. David and Claire will avoid jail time, but they're finished. They'll have to liquidate everything to pay the restitution and fines. They'll be left with, well, nothing. Good, I said, my voice flat. Julian leaned back, steepling his fingers. It's done, Nora. You won. He paused, his gaze analytical. Was it worth it? I thought of the hollowed-out look in Ethan's eyes, the painful dinner, the years of misunderstanding that had led us to this point. I thought of the 7-year-old with the gap-toothed grin and the lopsided mug. The war is over, Julian, I said, standing up and looking out the window at the city I owned. Now I have to survey the battlefield and see what can be salvaged. A month later, I stood with Ethan on the 48th floor of the Axton building. The sprawling corner office, with its panoramic views of the Hudson River, was completely empty. This had been David's headquarters, the seat of his phantom power. Now the carpets were bare, the walls were stark white, and the silence was absolute. Felt like a tomb. We could lease it, Ethan said, his voice echoing slightly in the vacant space. The market rate for a space like this is astronomical. We could, I agreed, walking over to the window where David's oversized desk once sat. From here he must have felt like a king. He had the view, but he never understood the foundation required to hold it up. What do you think we should do with it? I asked, turning to face him. It was a genuine question. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, looking around the empty office not as a potential asset, but as a scar. I think we should give it away, he said finally. Or at least not use it for us. Let a non-profit use it as their headquarters. Something that actually does some good. Let this space be for building something up, not for tearing things down. I looked at my son, truly seeing the man he was becoming. Thoughtful, deliberate, and more concerned with purpose than profit. The rubble of our family feud was becoming the foundation for something new. He nodded. I think that's an excellent idea. In the following months, I began the process of giving Ethan his real inheritance. It had nothing to do with stock portfolios or trust documents. We spent hours in my study, not going over earnings reports but over people. I taught him how I learned to read a room, to spot the subtle tells of deceit in a sycophant's smile, to understand the difference between loyalty and obedience. I laid out the blueprints for the NV Master Trust, explaining not just the legal architecture, but the philosophy of control and protection behind it. Power is not about being the loudest person in the room, I told him, tracing a finger over the complex diagram of ownership. It's about building the room, owning the walls, and controlling the door. And most importantly, knowing precisely why you're doing it. He was a quick study, his mind sharp and analytical now that it was cleared of his uncle's resentful narrative. He asked intelligent questions, challenging my assumptions, and bringing a fresh perspective that I hadn't realized I was missing. He wasn't just learning about my empire. He was preparing to be its steward. He was learning the weight of my name, and I saw that he would one day be strong enough to carry it. One rainy Tuesday, without any pretense, I called Ethan into my study. We need to set some new terms, I said, motioning to the chair opposite my desk. It felt less like a mother talking to her son and more like two sovereign nations negotiating a lasting peace. I agree, he said, sitting down. Rule 1, I began. No more secrets. You will be copied on all executive-level communications. You will know what I know. In return, I expect absolute honesty from you. If you disagree with me, you will tell me to my face, not to your aunt and uncle. Deal, he said without hesitation. Rule 2. We talk to each other first. No more letting resentment build. If something is wrong, we have dinner that night. And we solve it. I can agree to that, I said, feeling a sense of profound relief. And Rule 3, he added, his voice softer. You have to be present. I know the business is demanding, but I need my mother, not just my CEO. And I promise, he looked me straight in the eye, to see the mother first. That was the term that mattered most. It was the clause that repaired the deepest crack in our foundation. That is a deal, Ethan, I said. That is a promise. The assets reclaimed from David's failed division and Claire's sham charity amounted to a staggering sum. My first instinct was to absorb it back into the company, to fortify my fortress. But as I sat with Ethan, looking at the numbers on a spreadsheet, it felt like a hollow victory. It feels like blood money, Ethan said, voicing my own thoughts. It's the price of our family falling apart. Then let's build something new with it, I replied, an idea taking shape. Something clean. And so, we created the Vance Foundation. Not a vehicle for social climbing or tax evasion, but a legitimate, transparent, and powerful force for good in the city. We focused on educational grants for underprivileged students and funding for community arts programs, the two areas my late husband had been most passionate about. I made myself the chairperson of the board. And I named Ethan as the president and executive director, giving him full operational control. It was his chance to build a legacy of his own, not in the shadow of my skyscrapers, but out in the open. It was our first true partnership. A year later, I stood in the bustling auditorium of a newly renovated community theater in the Bronx. The air was filled with the excited chatter of students and their families. On stage, Ethan was at a podium, thanking the Vance Foundation for the grant that had saved the theater from closure. He spoke with a quiet confidence that made my heart swell with pride. My phone vibrated in my clutch. I glanced down. The screen read, Julian. A new crisis, no doubt. A competitor making a move, a deal on the verge of collapse. The kind of call that, for 30 years, would have been the most important thing in my world. I pressed the silence button on the side of the phone and slipped it back into my bag without a second thought. On stage, Ethan finished his speech to a wave of applause. He scanned the crowd, his eyes finding mine. He smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached all the way to his eyes. It was the same gap-toothed grin from the photo on my desk, just in the face of a man. Smiled back. The empire was secure. The enemies were gone. The money was just money. But this feeling of peace, of rightness, of connection to my son, this was victory. This was the only thing that had ever truly been the bottom line. In the end, my empire became quiet. The battles were over, the phone stopped ringing, and what was left was the fragile, precious peace I built with my son on the ashes of our old family. But I leave the final judgment to you. Do you think I did the right thing? I see two paths, and I want you to tell me which one you believe is the truth. Comment. Justified. If you think my scorched earth revenge was the only way to protect my son and my legacy from the people trying to destroy it. Comment. Too far. If you believe I became the monster they accused me of being, and that no betrayal warrants that level of destruction. I'll be reading every comment. You be the judge.